Silence, the kind that weighs on your chest and makes breathing difficult, pervaded the courtroom. Every seat was occupied, and everyone's attention was focused on the man in the middle. The medals on Sergeant Nathan Donovan's chest gleamed in the fluorescent lights as he sat in his wheelchair in his uniform. His hand was on the leash of Rocky, the German shepherd that accompanied him and was calm but alert. To Nathan, Rocky was so much more than the ordinary military working dog that he appeared to be to everyone else. He belonged to the family. The judge spoke to Nathan, telling him that this could be his last opportunity to speak, and Nathan's jaw tensed. Rocky was to be reassigned, deemed government property, and required for another assignment, the army had decided. The idea of losing Rocky now seemed like a harsh betrayal after years of putting their lives in danger together. Nathan's voice was only steady enough to speak, and his hands shook as he repositioned his hold on the leash. "Your Honor," he said in an emotionally charged tone. "Rocky is more than simply a useful military tool. In ways no one here could ever comprehend, he saved my life. He protected me from gunfire in the field, pulled me out of danger, and even alerted me to traps before I could see them. And Rocky was there when I got home, when I was unable to even look in the mirror. He provided me with motivation to continue. Don't take him away from me, please." The air was heavy with spoken pity, and the room remained motionless. While some onlookers wiped at their eyes, others looked at each other with a mixture of sympathy and indignation. The judge's expression stayed expressionless as he studied Nathan for a considerable amount of time before leaning forward to make his decision. But before he could finish speaking, an unforeseen circumstance occurred. Rocky jerked the leash from Nathan's shaking hands and stood up suddenly. The judge's words reverberated throughout the courtroom as the dog approached him and began to bark sharply. Despite Rocky's lack of violence, the bailiff automatically moved forward as the crowd gasped. His barks were forceful and deliberate, as though he were attempting to convey an urgent message. Nathan cried out, his voice cracking with fear, "Rocky!" But he knew in his heart. On the battlefield, he had witnessed similar conduct several times. Rocky was alerting, not only barking. The courtroom whispers became more intense. "What is the dog's condition?" From the back row came a whisper. Nathan wheeled himself forward, his voice shaking as his chest clenched. "He only barks when there is danger, otherwise, he is not just barking. He is attempting to alert us to something." The judge's eyes were fixed on Rocky as he froze, his gavel gone from his grasp. With the exception of the dog's heartbeat-like barks, the room became quiet once more. It was more than Nathan, whatever Rocky sensed. For the first time that day, Nathan felt a glimmer of optimism as he realized that the dog knew something that no one else did. This wasn't merely a farewell. Rocky wanted everyone to understand the greater picture that was about to happen. Other than Rocky's constant barking, the room was quiet. Every piercing voice reverberated throughout the courtroom, reflecting off the dark wooden walls and slicing like a blade through the tension. With his body tight, ears pulled back, and eyes fixed on the judge's bench, Rocky maintained a low stance. Nathan watched the dog, his hands tightening on his wheelchair's arms. This barking wasn't haphazard. There was no mistaking Rocky's body language. Something had caught his attention. With an adrenaline rush that brought back memories of his time on the battlefield, Nathan's heart raced. It wasn't war, though. This was meant to be an area of order, a courtroom. Nathan called, his voice steady but tremulous, "Rocky, heel." Rocky gave him a quick, stern look in return, as though to reassure his handler that he was in charge. Rocky immediately regained his concentration and began to pace in front of the judge's bench in short, purposeful strides. The room shivered when his barks changed to harsh, guttural growls. The audience's initial sympathy for Nathan turned into a tangible sense of dread as they started to mumble uneasily. "Mr. Donovan Rocky," the judge stated in an irritated tone. "Your Honor," Nathan interrupted, his voice steadier and louder, but his chest constricted with terror. "Control your dog or I will have to. Rocky isn't acting badly. He has been educated to recognize danger, bombs, explosives, and threats. He wouldn't behave in this manner unless he sensed a problem. The silence returned as Nathan's words took hold. His explanation changed the mood, bringing in a creeping sensation of fear in place of doubt. Rocky abruptly ceased barking before anyone could react. The sudden quiet was startling, even deafening. As Rocky's head shot toward the far end of the courtroom, his entire body became rigid. A low, dangerous growl rippled from his chest as his ears perked up. Even the judge froze at the abruptness and intensity of the transition. The courtroom's hefty wooden doors caught everyone's attention. The murmurs in the room became anxious whispers as a general uneasiness descended. Nathan followed Rocky's gaze, his breathing quickening. In his ears, his pulse roared. Before Rocky discovered a hidden explosive or warned of an enemy ambush, he had witnessed this precise conduct on the battlefield. Now, whatever Rocky felt wasn't good. Nathan's voice broke with anxiety as he murmured, "Rocky. What is it?" But Rocky remained motionless. His whole body stayed motionless, his growl deepening and reverberating across the atmosphere like a warning. Whatever danger he had sensed, Nathan no longer saw it as merely a threat. It had the potential to endanger everyone in that room. Everyone in the courtroom froze in place as Rocky's low roar echoed like distant thunder. Everyone's attention was on the dog, who was tight and staring at the massive wooden doors at the other end of the room. Even the judge, who only a few seconds before had been ready to chastise Nathan, appeared uneasy now. He looked anxiously at the bailiffs, his gavel still forgotten in his hand. There was a tension in the air that no one could describe, and it felt electrifying. Nathan's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests as though preparing for an explosion, and his breath came more quickly. Too many times to count, he had witnessed this before. Rocky's instincts had proven the difference between life and death on the battlefield. One thing had always been the meaning of his warning. It was pretty near to danger. Nathan whispered to himself, "Remain composed," but even he found the words to be meaningless. The bailiffs paused by the judge's bench, uncertain of what to do. Finally, one of them, a large, swarthy-looking man, moved forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "Isn't it simply a dog?" he muttered, but it was clear from his voice that he was uncomfortable, maybe due to the crowd or the loudness. Even while he spoke, however, his motions were methodical and his feet cautious. Nathan shook his head, raising his voice just enough to be heard above the crowd's whispers. "No, this is not how Rocky responds to people or noise. He is educated to recognize danger in things that are invisible to us. Believe me, there's a reason he's roaring that way." No one moved for a second as his words lingered in the air. At last, the judge, who was clearly uneasy, nodded to the bailiffs and gave them instructions to check the door. As the bailiffs got closer to the door, Rocky's snarl became more intense. With hesitation, the bigger man extended his hand and grasped the metal handle. The room appeared to hold its breath for a while. Every muscle in Nathan's body tensed with anticipation, and his heart raced. The handle started to spin, but Rocky's body stayed rigid, his growls becoming a series of short, biting barks. With a creak, the door opened to expose the dim hallway outside. It appeared empty at first, but Rocky's barking only grew louder as his gaze remained focused on an invisible object. With his hand still on his firearm, the bigger bailiff stepped into the corridor. Pale-faced, he looked back at the courtroom before turning back. The silence was broken a second later by his voice. "Something's here." Nathan sat forward in his chair, his chest constricted with fear, and his pulse accelerated. Nathan understood better than anyone else, and whatever the bailiff had seen was enough to awaken Rocky's instincts. Rocky was always correct. As if the stress itself were sucking the oxygen out of the courtroom, the air seemed to get thicker. The harsh echoes of Rocky's barking bounced off the wooden walls. With his head down, muscles stiff, and his eyes laser-focused on the dark hallway beyond the open door, his body stayed in a position of unwavering awareness. With his boots clicking softly on the tiled floor, the larger bailiff, who was now clearly uncomfortable, took another tentative step closer. His body tensed with caution, his hand hovering close to his weapon as if he were waiting for something to leap out of the darkness. "What's happening outside?" The judge, trying to remain in control, made a small cracking sound as he demanded. He held the gavel firmly, his knuckles white, his gaze flitting anxiously between Rocky and the doorway. Everyone in the courtroom felt their spines tingle as the dog's growls became more intense, a low, threatening rumbling. The bigger bailiff's face was pinched with uncertainty and pallid as he looked back toward the room. With hesitation, he responded, "I don't see anything." He speaks in a methodical manner, yet something doesn't feel quite right. His eyes returned to the corridor, his forehead wrinkled as though he were attempting to dispel his own misgivings. "It is far too quiet." His voice was hardly more than a whisper, yet it sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Nathan's gut twisted into knots as he leaned forward in his wheelchair. Too quietly, he had heard those words numerous times on the battlefield, and each time they had come before catastrophe. His voice soared, piercing the crowd's growing whispers. Nothing causes Rocky to react. There must be a cause for his behavior. We must now leave the room. Fear and confusion gripped the onlookers as they froze in response to his urgent instruction. Pulling a flashlight from his belt, the smaller bailiff moved forward, directing the illumination into the corridor. The entire length of the polished floor was illuminated by the brilliant light that broke through the shadows. "There's nothing," he said in a nervous tone. Even though the corridor is empty, his fingers shook a little as he spoke, revealing his composed demeanor. But Rocky was anything but at ease. As the dog's bulk pulled forward, nearly ripping the leash from Nathan's grasp, his growl only got louder and his barking more furious. Then, amid the oppressive quiet, there was a piercing metallic clang that reverberated down the corridor. The smaller bailiff took an automatic step back and shuddered, his flashlight beam trembling. With a fierce growl, Rocky sprang toward the sound, straining against his leash and scratching his claws on the ground. Panic spread through the throng as gasps came from the courtroom. The bigger bailiff's voice was tight with anxiety as he automatically pulled out his handgun. What on earth was that? As he spoke above the commotion, Nathan's heart thumped in his chest. His voice trembled with a mixture of assurance and panic as he screamed, "Get Rocky back. He is always correct." Something is approaching, but before anyone could react, the metallic clang reverberated, this time more loudly, as though the source was now considerably closer. The room was filled with a sense of dread as the air felt heavy and charged with an unseen force. Regardless matter what Rocky had sensed, the question now was when rather than if. Like an alarm blaring in the depths of the corridor, the metallic clang reverberated, this time closer and sharper. The weight of the uncertainty bearing down on everyone in the courtroom caused the tension to suddenly tighten. Rocky let up a loud bark, his body tensing against the leash as if his resolve alone could force his way through the door and face whatever lay beyond. With his hands white and his heart pounding in his ears, Nathan held on to the leash hard. Now he sensed it, too. There was a problem. There was an impending event. The bigger bailiff entered the hall completely. He had his revolver out and was looking around the dark hallway. With his flashlight wavering a little in his fingers, his buddy followed warily. Despite the ray piercing the darkness, the corridor seemed deserted, quiet, and motionless. However, Rocky continued to bark, his growls becoming louder and more forceful. Though Nathan could already sense the anxiety gripping the room, his instincts begged him to take action and yell for an evacuation. Nobody was on the go. "Are you able to see anything?" The judge leaned forward in his chair and yelled, his voice breaking. His customary aura of oracuity was replaced with an unmistakable edge of anxiety as the gavel shook slightly in his grasp. The bigger bailiff, his face white and sweaty, looked over his shoulder. "Nothing yet," he answered in a tight, quiet voice, as though he was worried that talking too loudly would agitate whatever could be hiding. "It doesn't feel right, though." The sound of his boots reverberated down the hallway as he stepped forward once more. There was a worried murmur among the courtroom attendees, with some gripping their possessions and others slowly making their way to the exits. The tense atmosphere in the room was growing rapidly. Nathan rolled forward a little, staring at Rocky, who had fallen silent once more. The dog's body was immobile, his eyes were still focused on the open doorway, and his ears were stiff. Nathan's voice was shaking as he said, "Rocky's locked onto something. It's there, but I have no idea what it is." Then, when the bailiff got halfway down the corridor, a shadow shifted. The smaller bailiff staggered backward, his flashlight beam swinging erratically, but it was fleeting, barely noticeable. "There," in a panicked voice, he yelled. With his rifle springing up and directed at the darkness, the larger bailiff froze. Rocky started barking once more, slamming so forcefully against his leash that Nathan's hold almost broke. Nathan yelled, "Back up," his voice reverberated throughout the courtroom. "Leave the place." In an attempt to restore order, the judge slammed his gavel, but the sound was lost in the escalating mayhem. People were getting up from their chairs, and as the terror grew, whispers became yells. Then there was another sound, a heavy, purposeful footstep, coming from the hallway's darkness. It was not rushed. There was no hurry. It was approaching and it was quiet. Rocky's barking became a growl. His body thrust forward relentlessly, his teeth bared. Dread surged through Nathan, tightening his chest. There was no rush in whatever was in that corridor. It wasn't concealed. It wanted to be noticed and was headed directly for them. The hefty footsteps sliced through the escalating tumult like a sword, echoing louder than the courtroom could handle. Nathan had to secure himself in his wheelchair to prevent being jerked forward as Rocky's snarls filled the air and his body pulled violently on the leash. Now the tension was oppressive. All eyes were fixed on the dim corridor, the origin of the noise that nobody wanted to confront. Everyone maintains their composure. The judge yelled and slammed his gavel once again, but the order was ignored. Individuals were getting up from their chairs, gripping their hands, their bags, or anything else they could find, as though doing so would protect them from the unidentified danger. With his rifle up and pointed into the darkness, the larger bailiff stood motionless in the hallway. The flashlight beam darted frantically around the walls, catching every shadow but exposing nothing tangible, while his colleagues stayed behind him. The growing din was broken by Nathan's voice. His voice was harsh and forceful as he said, "Get out of there. That's not safe, whatever it is." The bigger bailiff remained motionless, but his words were like a knife. Rather, he narrowed his eyes into the dark hallway, his jaw clenched, and the shadow shifted once more. This time, everything was clear, slow, methodical, and intentional. With his flashlight wobbling in his frightened grasp, the smaller bailiff let out an audible gasp. His voice was no more than a whisper as he muttered, "There's someone there." For an instant the light caught something, a tall, menacing silhouette. It was enough to send a ripple of panic through the room, but it vanished almost as fast as it had appeared, receding back into the darkness. With a steady yet low voice, the larger bailiff gripped his firearm tighter. With a strong tone, he screamed, "Show yourself. Move out of my line of sight." The only answer, however, was quiet, a heavy, deafening silence that seemed to go on forever. Rocky's body coiled like a spring, ready to lunge, and his teeth were bared as his barking reached a fever pitch. Then it took place. The figure moved slowly, serenely, almost unflinchingly into the light. It was a man with his hands in the pockets of a bulky coat and his face hidden by a hood. Despite the mayhem he had wreaked, his posture was strangely comfortable and his motions were purposeful. His head cocked slightly, as though amused by what he saw, he stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Nathan struggled to restrain Rocky as his snarl went wild and his claws scraped the ground. "Who are you?" With his rifle fixed on the figure, the larger bailiff made a demand. The man remained silent. Rather, he advanced slowly once more, with a slight smirk peeking out from under his hood. An overwhelming feeling of dread overcame Nathan, causing his breath to catch in his chest. There was something about the man that felt wrong, not just dangerous, but profoundly, deeply wrong. Both bailiffs tensed and tightened their grips on their rifles as the man slowly lifted his hands. The man's voice was low, serene, and chillingly assured as he whispered, "Relax. I don't mean to offend," but the way he talked and the way his words hung in the air only served to chill the atmosphere. Rocky and Nathan both saw this man's deceit right away. The man stood at the edge of the corridor, his form half illuminated by the flashlight's shaky beam, and the room fell into stunned quiet. Now, Rocky's low, guttural growls reverberated throughout the anxious courtroom. Despite their years of training, the bailiffs' hands trembled as they clutched their firearms firmly. As Nathan gazed at the stranger, his heart pounded in his chest. The man's stance was too composed, too methodical, as though he enjoyed the discomfort he was causing. The larger bailiff commanded, "Step forward, slowly." His voice was taut with oracuity, yet there was a tinge of dread in it. The man took a step closer, his boots tapping softly on the tiled floor, then cocked his head slightly, his face still hidden by the hood. He walked with a spooky assurance, taking his time and being deliberate, as if he were relishing every moment of the attention that was suddenly focused on him. With a snarl, Rocky sprang forward against his tether, his claws scuffing the ground. Nathan's grip tightened as he strained to keep him back, his sweat-slick hands. Nathan murmured beneath his breath, his voice shaking, "Rocky knows. He is aware that something is wrong. He can sense it." The judge gave him a fleeting glance, his face displaying a mix of surprise and dread, but his remarks were not loud enough to be heard over the crowd. With a flashlight in one hand and another hanging close to his holster, the smaller bailiff took a step forward. "Identify yourself now, sir," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. At last, the man raised his head, revealing a portion of his face beneath the darkness cast by his hood. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine from the intensity in his cold, piercing, and keen eyes. The man reiterated in a calm but unnervingly empty voice, "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Slowly, both bailiffs stiffened and raised their weapons higher as he reached inside his pocket. "He's got something," someone muttered in the rear as gasps echoed through the courtroom. The tension in the room felt like it was about to explode, like a thin thread that may break at any time. Though Nathan's instincts begged him to take action, he remained motionless, clutching Rocky's leash as though it were the only thing keeping him in the present. The stranger's hand came out of his pocket with a tiny, metal object in it. "Drop it," the bailiffs yelled in unison. The man froze, a small sneer curving his lips. "Calm down," he murmured easily, holding up the object, which glinted in the low light and turned out to be a straightforward key. However, there was no sense of relaxation or security, and Nathan's uneasiness simply grew. Rocky continued to bark, his attention fixed on the man as though the key were merely a diversion. Nathan mumbled to himself, "It's not what it looks like, he's hiding something he has to be," and his hold on the leash tightened. The fear in the room became oppressive as the man's smile grew as though he could hear Nathan's thoughts. It seemed as though the room was about to collapse. The man with the key had everyone's attention, and his sly smile stood in stark contrast to the fear that was engulfing the courtroom. With his deep, guttural growls, Rocky's barking was unrelenting, as though he was attempting to raise an alarm that no one could ignore. The weight of Nathan's instincts roared louder than the mayhem around him, causing his hands to shake as he gripped the leash tighter. There was a problem. This individual wasn't merely a danger, rather, he represented the beginning of something much more sinister. With his handgun still aimed at the man, the larger bailiff snarled once more as he dropped the key and backed away. The smaller bailiff approached cautiously, his face pale with anxiety but his flashlight steady. The man cocked his head slightly, his eyes darting to Rocky as if unperturbed by the guns aimed at him. "That dog is unique, isn't he?" he asked in a quiet, nearly conversational voice. "He is extremely valuable because he always knows things before they happen." Although he spoke in a calm tone, the gravity of what he said caused fear to spread throughout the audience. Nathan felt sick to his stomach. How did this man learn about Rocky's skills and intuition? Nathan compelled himself to speak, the hair standing on end on the back of his neck. How are you aware of that? His voice was both sharp and trembling as he urged. As if to shield Nathan from something only he could see, Rocky lunged forward against the leash and growled even louder. The man's eyes glinted with something malevolent, and his sneer widened. With careful, almost taunting gestures, the stranger slowly raised the key. His voice was cold with conviction as he continued, "You'll find out soon enough." Then he turned the key in his hand, and there was a crisp metallic click. Although the sound was faint, its impact was instantaneous. Rocky became furious and began barking more loudly than before. And the courtroom lights flashed violently before anyone could react. Nathan heard cries, gasps, and the scrape of chairs as people scurried in terror as a moment of complete blackness engulfed the room. The stranger was not alone when the lights flickered back on. There were two more individuals behind him, stepping out of the corridor like living shadows. Although their faces were hidden, they moved purposefully and exuded a sense of threat. They both carried weapons, jagged metal forms that glinted sufficiently in the light to reveal their intent. Nathan's heart pounded as he turned to face Rocky, who was now snarling with such intensity that it sounded almost animalistic. It was no longer merely a man with a key, whatever was going on. It was only the beginning of something much, much larger. There was complete anarchy in the courtroom. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as spectators pushed toward the exits, voices rising in panic and confusion. Behind the stranger, two individuals stepped farther into the space, their very presence causing everyone to shudder with fear. With his body low and every muscle in his body poised to launch himself forward, Rocky let out a constant bark. With adrenaline pumping through him, Nathan's hold on the leash tightened. There was no doubt in his mind that the stranger was not playing a bluff. They were here because of Rocky. The judge slammed his gavel once again and cried, "Everyone, stay calm," but the panic that was building in the room overpowered his voice. With his torch now trained on the stranger, the bigger bailiff moved forward and held his ground. "Remain where you are," he ordered. The stranger, however, continued. Rather, he advanced slowly once more, his steps purposeful, his face uncannily composed. The oppressive atmosphere was increased by the figures behind him mirroring his pace. When the visitor did speak, his measured, silky voice broke through the cacophony. "Nobody should be harmed. I just want the dog." The tone of oracuity in his voice sent shivers down Nathan's spine, even if his words were calm. Unwavering in his posture, Rocky snarled low, his piercing eyes fixed on the stranger. Nathan felt his heart racing. "You're not taking him," he stated in a firm but emotionally charged voice. With a firm grip on the leash, he wheeled himself a little closer to Rocky. "He is more than a dog. He is my family and my partner. Who you are and what you believe you are entitled to don't matter to me. You're not going to take him." The room seemed to hold its breath for a time as his words lingered in the air. The stranger's eyes narrowed as he saw Nathan, and his smirk vanished. "You're adding unnecessary complexity to this," he remarked calmly. The tiniest trace of annoyance flickered over his face as he turned back to Rocky. "He is unique. You are aware of it, but it will only be more difficult for you if you keep him." Nathan clenched his teeth and held tight to Rocky's leash. With a stern and unshakable voice, he said, "Rocky stays with me." The crowd's whispers became louder around him once more, with some urging for peace and others expressing fear of what would come next. Every moment seemed to drag on forever, and the tension in the room was intolerable. With another piercing bark, Rocky brought the room back to reality. He was completely focused on the stranger, as though he understood the stakes. Leaning forward in his chair, Nathan's chest constricted, prepared to do whatever it needed to keep safe the one creature that had never failed him. Nathan was sure of one thing, regardless of the stranger's intentions. This standoff was far from over, and Rocky was not leaving. The courtroom was tense, with the stranger standing still and everyone else in the room trapped in a feeling of uneasiness. With his body still coiled and prepared to protect, he stared at Rocky while the dog's low growls rumbled like distant thunder. Gripping the leash with both hands, Nathan gazed straight at the stranger, his own resolve mirroring the steadfast devotion of his companion. Behind the stranger, the two creatures stood motionless, their presence threatening but not moving. There was a stalemate that seemed to go on forever. Breaking the oppressive stillness, the judge cleared his throat and spoke as authoritatively as he could. "A court of law has been disturbed by you. This is over. Get these folks out of here, bailiffs." The tiny trembling in his voice was enough to rekindle the tension. Regaining their poise, the bailiffs moved ahead with caution. Rocky barked sharply again. His eyes followed the newcomer's every motion, his teeth bared. Slowly, the guy held up a hand to tell his friends to stop. His face changed from one of rage to one more akin to resignation. Calmly, he remarked, "This isn't over," with a foreboding tone. "You believe that the dog is the only thing at stake, but it's much more than that. You'll see in due time." He stepped back, his smirk reappearing, but this time it was cold and calculated, with no warmth. "I'll go for the time being, but Nathan and I will return since he is ours." Nathan's hold on Rocky's leash never relaxed as his chest grew tighter. "Whatever you're after, you'll have to go through both of us," he stated firmly, his voice clear and strong. "He belongs to no one but me." His words sounded like steel, and the guy stumbled for the first time, his eyes narrowing as though he was giving Nathan one last look. Then, without saying another word, he turned and gestured for his friends to follow. It was not until they had vanished through the same doors they had entered that the tension in the room subsided. The ensuing hush was deafening. Whispers ran through the crowd as spectators slowly made their way back to their seats, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. With a trembling hand, the judge put down his gavel and let out a deep breath. With his voice scarcely audible above the muttering, he muttered wearily, "This court is adjourned." However, Nathan didn't move, his gaze still focused on the entrance. At last, Rocky sat down, his growls lessened but his body still vigilant. Nathan's hand moved lightly over the dog's head as he reached down. "You did good, buddy," he said in a hushed tone, his voice full of thanks and fatigue. Nathan remained behind as the courtroom gradually cleared out, his mind racing. He had no idea who that man was or why they desired Rocky, but he was certain that this was not the end of it. But for the time being, Nathan allowed himself to experience the silent relief of Rocky leaning on his leg. Together, they would confront whatever lay ahead. Because no matter what, their link would always be unshakable, and no one could take that away.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.